The sun fell softly over the kingdom, painting the sky with warm colors as the capital prepared for another day. Inside the great palace, Queen Ilara sat quietly by the window of her chamber. She looked out at the streets below where children laughed, merchants shouted their offers, and guards marched in steady lines. The queen had ruled for 3 years since the passing of her father, and though her people respected her, she often felt the loneliness of the crown. Every decision she made was judged, every word weighed, every step watched. The court had long advised her to marry, not for love, but for the strength of the throne. Many princes from neighboring lands had offered their hands, some with promises of gold, others with promises of soldiers. But Ilara had chosen someone different, a man who was not born of high rank or wealth. His name was Daniel, a quiet man from a distant province, with nothing more than his honest eyes and steady voice. When she announced her choice, the nobles gasped and whispered in the hall. They could not understand why a queen would tie herself to someone of such common blood. Some called it foolish, others called it dangerous. Ilara herself wondered if she had chosen wisely, but she remembered the way Daniel had spoken to her, not as a queen but as a person. He had not promised her riches or armies. He had only said that he would stand with her no matter what storms came. The wedding had been small compared to the grand feasts of old. Some nobles attended out of duty, others stayed away in protest. Daniel stood beside her, calm and silent, never once flinching at the cold stares that surrounded them. Ilara could feel the doubt of her people, but when she looked at him, she felt something steady, like a flame that would not go out no matter how the wind blew. Life in the palace was not easy for Daniel. Servants bowed to him because of his place beside the queen, but many did not respect him. Commanders of the guard ignored him, advisors spoke over him, and nobles sneered behind closed doors. Still, Daniel never raised his voice. He listened, he observed, and when asked, he gave short and clear answers. To most, he seemed too simple, too plain to be worthy of the queen. Ilara tried to understand him more. At dinners, she would ask about his past, but he spoke little. He mentioned his province, the hard winters, the work he did with his hands, and the friends he had lost to sickness and war. There was pain in his eyes, but he never told the full story. She felt there was more hidden behind the silence, yet she did not press him. The kingdom itself was not at peace. Across the borders, other rulers were growing restless, building armies and forging new weapons. Whispers of war reached the palace almost every week. The Queen's Council urged her to seek stronger allies, to marry into power, to secure the throne with force. And every time they said it, their eyes turned to Daniel as if to say he was nothing but a weak link in the chain. Ilara carried these worries at night. In the quiet of her chamber, she wondered if her people would ever accept Daniel, if her decision would weaken her rule. Sometimes she questioned herself, asking if she had chosen with her heart rather than her duty. But whenever she looked at Daniel, sitting calmly by her side, she felt her doubts soften. One evening, as they walked through the palace garden, she spoke her fear aloud. She told him of the whispers, of the doubts, of the voices that said she had made a mistake. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her with steady eyes and said only a few words. He told her that she did not need to fear, because when the time came, he would be ready. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Ilara did not know what he meant, but she felt the truth in his tone. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of something hidden, like a shadow of strength waiting to be revealed. She did not ask more. She only walked beside him, wondering what kind of man she had truly married. The kingdom slept that night, unaware of the storm that was slowly building beyond its borders. But in the silence of the palace, a quiet bond was forming between a queen and the man she had chosen. A bond that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The days in the palace passed with quiet tension. The court was never truly silent, for whispers carried through the halls like wind through trees. Whenever Queen Ilara walked with Daniel at her side, courtiers bowed with stiff smiles, yet behind her back she could hear them murmur. They said the queen had tied herself to a man with no crown, no army, and no noble blood. Some claimed he was a burden she would soon regret. Ilara tried to ignore these voices, but even she could not escape them entirely. At council meetings, the advisors would give her long speeches about the dangers beyond the border. The neighboring empire had been gathering troops, testing their weapons along the frontier, and sending spies across the land. The Queen's generals urged her to strengthen alliances. They suggested sending envoys to distant kings, promising trade and marriage in return for aid. Each time they spoke, their eyes slid toward Daniel, as though he were an empty seat at the table. Daniel did not answer their looks or their words. He sat quietly beside the Queen, listening as men argued about war and treaties. When Alara asked for his thoughts, he would speak with calm, clear words, but never with many. He would say what he believed, often in simple terms that left the nobles frowning. They preferred grand speeches, yet Daniel's voice carried a kind of certainty that unsettled them. One evening, the Queen walked through the stone corridors alone. She passed soldiers sharpening their blades and scribes, carrying messages sealed with wax. The air smelled of smoke and ink, heavy with the weight of preparation. She paused at the window, looking out at the horizon. In the distance, the mountains cast long shadows across the land, and beyond them, she knew marched an army that might soon test her throne. She thought of her marriage. Had she chosen Daniel out of duty or desire, or perhaps both? She could not yet tell. She remembered how calm he was, how unshaken by insults. She remembered his promise that he would protect her when the time came. But what could one man do against an army? That night she found Daniel in the garden. The torches glowed softly, casting light on the leaves and flowers that swayed with the evening wind. He was standing near the fountain, his hands resting on the stone edge, his eyes watching the ripples of water. She joined him and told him what the council had said. She repeated their fears, their demands for allies, their doubts about him. Daniel listened without moving. As she finished, he turned his gaze toward her. His expression was calm as always, but his words carried a steady weight. He told her that fear makes men shout, but true strength is often quiet. He said that when danger comes, the noise of the court will fade, and what matters is not the titles of men, but the courage they hold inside. Alara felt both comfort and confusion in his words. She wanted to believe him, but she also carried the burden of her people. If she failed, they would suffer. She looked at him and asked, almost in a whisper, what strength he carried. Daniel did not boast or explain. He only said that time would reveal what needed to be shown. Days later, news arrived of border villages burned by raiders. Survivors came to the capital with stories of soldiers in strange armor, moving with precision, striking with weapons that could cut through walls. The court erupted in fear. Some nobles urged the Queen to surrender land in exchange for peace, while others begged her to raise an army at once. Daniel watched the panic without flinching. He stood near the Queen as voices rose around the table. When no one could agree, he finally spoke. His words were simple, yet sharp, like a blade cutting through noise. He told them panic would only destroy them faster than any enemy. He reminded them that the kingdom was strong if they stood together, weak if they divided. The room fell quiet, not because they trusted him, but because his voice carried a calmness that none of them had. Alara looked at him in that moment and felt something stir inside her, something she could not name. She began to wonder if he carried secrets far greater than she had imagined. That night, as the fires burned low in the city, Alara lay awake in her chamber. The world outside her walls was changing. War was no longer a distant shadow, but a storm, moving closer each day. She turned her head and saw Daniel resting quietly, his face calm even in sleep. She whispered into the darkness, asking herself who he truly was. The answer had not yet come, but she felt that soon the truth would rise, and when it did, it might change everything. The news of the border attacks spread quickly through the kingdom. Families in the villages left behind their homes and rushed to the capital, carrying only what they could hold. The streets grew crowded with tired faces, children clinging to their mothers, and farmers who had once lived in peace, now begging for safety. The people looked to the palace, hoping the Queen would protect them. Inside the grand hall, Queen Alara stood before her council. Her crown felt heavy on her head, not because of its weight, but because of the burden of choice. The generals argued over maps, pointing at rivers and mountains, debating where the enemy would strike next. The nobles bickered over wealth and resources, worried more about their estates than the people. Their voices clashed like swords, but none offered calm. Daniel sat quietly at her side. He had no title, no command, and yet his presence felt stronger than the nobles who raised their voices. He listened as if every word mattered, though his face remained still. When one of the nobles mocked him again, asking why a simple man should sit at the queen's table, Ilara expected Daniel to remain silent, as always. But this time he spoke. His voice was steady and low, yet it carried through the hall. He said that a war cannot be won by fear or by selfishness. He reminded them that the kingdom was not just castles and gold, but the people who tilled the fields, who raised the walls, who bled to keep the borders safe. His words silenced the room, though not all agreed. Some frowned, others scoffed, but none dared interrupt him. Ilara looked at him, surprised yet moved. She had seen glimpses of his strength before, but this was different. There was a sharpness in his tone, a command that came naturally. She wondered again who he truly was. The council ended with no clear plan, but the queen ordered the guards to prepare the city's defenses. Soldiers began training day and night in the yards, while blacksmiths forged blades and armor without rest. Fear spread like smoke through the capital, but beneath it, a quiet determination began to grow. One evening, Ilara walked through the training grounds. She watched young men and women practice with wooden swords, their faces pale with fear. Daniel was there, standing among them, not dressed in silk, but in simple clothes. He lifted a practice sword and showed them how to hold it, how to stand, how to move with purpose. His movements were sharp, efficient, and practiced, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. The soldiers watched in awe, their doubts slowly replaced by respect. He corrected their stances, guided their strikes, and reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand in spite of it. Ilara stood in silence, watching him. In that moment, she no longer saw the quiet husband mocked by the court, but a man who carried a past too deep to name. That night, she confronted him in the garden, where the moon cast silver light over the stones. She asked him directly who he was before he came to her side. Daniel did not answer at once. He looked up at the stars, his face calm, but his eyes heavy. At last he told her only that he had seen war before, that he had walked roads soaked in blood, and that he had sworn never to return to that life unless he had no choice. Ilara wanted to ask more, but she stopped herself. She saw the shadow in his eyes, the kind that came only from scars of the soul. She understood then that his silence was not weakness, but the shield of a man who had carried too much. Days later, the storm finally arrived. The enemy struck the outer defenses with sudden force. Villages near the border were crushed, and the survivors fled once again toward the capital. The air shook with the sound of drums and the clash of weapons. In the palace, the council panicked, demanding retreat and surrender. But when all seemed uncertain, Daniel stepped forward. He spoke not with fear, but with command. He told the soldiers to hold the lines, to protect the gates, and to trust in each other. His words were not long, but they cut through despair like fire through night. The men and women listened, their eyes drawn to him, as though he were already their commander. Ilara stood beside him, her heart racing. She knew then that the moment he had promised was near. The time had come for him to reveal the strength he had kept hidden for so long. The morning sky was dark with smoke as the enemy pressed against the outer walls of the capital. The sound of war drums echoed through the valleys, and fire lit the horizon. People inside the city trembled, praying that the walls would hold. The palace gates were shut tight, and soldiers stood ready, though fear showed in their eyes. Queen Ilara stood on the balcony of the palace, looking down at the chaos spreading through the streets. Messengers ran in every direction, carrying orders, carrying warnings, carrying pleas for help. The city was alive with fear, but also with the hope that their queen would lead them. She held her crown firmly, but inside her heart raced faster than ever before. Daniel stood beside her, calm as stone. He watched the enemy banners in the distance, his face unreadable. He had been quiet for too long, but now the time had come. The queen turned to him, asking if they could survive such a storm. He did not give a speech. He only said that the people must see strength, not fear. Then he walked down into the courtyard. The soldiers gathered around, weary and broken, expecting orders from their commanders. But Daniel stepped before them, his voice carrying across the yard. He spoke simply, yet each word struck deep. He told them that this was their home, their families, their land, and that no invader would take it while they still stood. He reminded them that courage was not born in bloodlines, but in the hearts of those willing to fight for what they loved. Their fear did not vanish, but something stronger stirred within them. For the first time they saw not just a quiet man, but a leader who carried himself with certainty. Even the generals, who had once mocked him, fell silent. The queen watched from above, her heart filled with awe. As the enemy forces struck the first gates, Daniel led the defenders himself. He carried no golden armor, no shining crown, only the steel of a sword and the weight of his will. His movements were sharp and precise, his commands clear and steady. He knew where to place the archers, where to move the shields, where to strike hardest. Every decision came as if he had lived this battle 100 times before. The clash began with a roar. Arrows rained down, and the walls shook with the force of heavy weapons. Yet Daniel did not falter. He moved among the men, fighting alongside them, his blade cutting through the chaos with deadly grace. Soldiers who had once doubted him now fought with new fire, inspired by his courage. They shouted his name, their fear turning into strength. Queen Alara stood at the ramparts, her voice joining the calls of her people. She saw Daniel in the heart of the fight, and she understood at last. The man she had married was not just a quiet husband. He was a warrior who had hidden his past, a man forged by battles no one else had seen. His silence had been the mark of someone who carried scars too deep to share, yet his strength was greater than any crown. The enemy pressed harder, but Daniel's tactics turned the tide. He used traps hidden in the streets, walls built with purpose, and ambushes that struck with perfect timing. Every move he made seemed to outmatch the invaders. The defenders began to believe again. The city that had trembled with fear now roared with defiance. By nightfall, the first wave of the enemy was broken. Fires burned in the distance, but the capital still stood. The people cheered from the walls, their voices rising into the night sky. The first time in years, they did not feel weak or helpless. They felt strong, because one man had shown them what strength truly meant. When Daniel returned to the palace, his face was marked with dirt and sweat, his sword heavy in his hand. The queen met him in the courtyard. She looked into his eyes, seeing both the calm she had always known and the fire she had only now discovered. She whispered that he had saved them, but he only shook his head. He said the battle was not over and the days ahead would test them even more. Still, in that moment, the bond between them grew stronger than before. Alara knew she had chosen not a weak man, but the one man who could stand when all others fell. And as the night sky glowed with the light of distant flames, she understood that his true strength had only begun to reveal itself. The night after the battle was heavy with smoke, but the city still stood. People lit candles in the streets, not for mourning but for hope. They sang songs of courage, their voices carrying across the rooftops. For the first time in many years, the people felt pride. They had faced the storm, and they had not been broken. Inside the palace, Queen Alara walked slowly through the grand hall. Her gown was torn from the day's struggle, her crown tilted on her head, but her spirit was unshaken. She thought of how close they had come to falling, how fear had almost crushed them, and how one man had changed everything. Daniel stood at the far end of the hall, speaking with soldiers who had survived the fight. His voice was low, but firm as he thanked them for their bravery. They listened with respect, no longer seeing him as a simple man, but as a leader who had stood with them in the fire. When he finished, they bowed to him, not out of duty, but out of true honor. Lara approached him, her steps quiet on the stone floor. When he turned to her, she saw not just the calm husband she had married, but the warrior who had revealed himself. She told him that the people were alive because of him, that the kingdom stood because of him. Daniel shook his head gently. He said the kingdom stood because they had all fought together, because fear had been replaced by courage. The days that followed were filled with hard work. The enemy had been pushed back but not destroyed. Scouts reported that another wave was gathering beyond the border, larger than the first. The generals once again filled the war room with arguments, but this time their voices were different. They did not mock Daniel or ignore his words. They turned to him, waiting for his guidance. Daniel stood over the maps, his finger tracing the lines of rivers and roads. He spoke clearly, giving orders with certainty. He told them where to place their men, how to build stronger defenses, and how to use the land itself as a weapon. His mind worked with speed, every detail fitting into a greater plan. Even the most stubborn nobles nodded in agreement, unable to deny his wisdom. Queen Alara watched him with quiet pride. She no longer doubted her choice. She no longer wondered if her people would accept him. She knew now that he was not only her husband, but the shield of the kingdom. His strength was not in the title he lacked, but in the courage he carried. When the enemy returned, the capital was ready. The walls had been rebuilt, the soldiers trained, the traps laid with care. Daniel led from the front, his presence steady, his commands sure. The enemy struck with fury, but every strike was met with resolve. Arrows filled the sky, blades clashed, and the earth shook with the roar of battle, yet the defenders held their ground. In the heart of the fight, Daniel stood unyielding. His sword moved with precision, his eyes sharp, his voice carrying across the battlefield. Men and women rallied to him, fighting not for crowns or gold, but for each other, for their home, for the queen who stood on the walls with her people. Lara shouted encouragement from above, her voice strong, her spirit shining. The battle lasted through the day and into the night, but in the end, the enemy broke. Their banners fell, their soldiers scattered, and their leaders fled. And the kingdom had not only survived, but had won. Cheers rose from the walls, echoing into the hills. The people shouted the name of their queen, and with it, the name of the man who had stood beside her. When the fires were put out and the wounded cared for, Alara and Daniel walked together through the city streets. The people knelt as they passed, not out of fear but out of love and respect. Children ran forward with flowers, pressing them into Daniel's hands. Old men bowed deeply, tears in their eyes. The queen smiled as she saw her people honor the man she had chosen. At the palace gates, Alara turned to Daniel. She told him that his true strength had saved them, that the kingdom would remember his courage for generations. Daniel looked at her, his eyes soft, and said he had done only what he promised, to stand with her, no matter what storms came. The dawn rose behind them, golden light spilling over the city. The war was not forgotten, but the kingdom was stronger, its people united. Queen Alara and Daniel stood together, side by side, their bond unshakable. They were no longer just queen and husband. They were the heart of a kingdom that had found its strength in them both. And so, their story became more than whispers in the court. It became a legend, told by firelight, carried by song, remembered by every soul who had lived through the dark days. It was the story of a queen who believed, and a man who revealed his true strength,